They mocked the old man's ancient rifle. What he did next left everyone speechless. "That thing belongs in a museum, not on a range," laughed the young Marine, pointing at the weathered rifle the elderly man was assembling. The entire shooting range erupted in snickers as they watched him load what looked like World War II ammunition. But when the targets went up and the old man took his position, something happened that made every single person go dead silent. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton's outdoor shooting range. It was qualification day for Alpha Company's newest Marines, fresh out of boot camp and eager to prove themselves with their state-of-the-art M4 carbines. The air buzzed with nervous energy and confident chatter as 20-something Marines checked their equipment and talked trash about their expected scores. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen walked the line, inspecting weapons and offering last-minute advice to his young charges. At 35, he'd seen enough cocky recruits to know that confidence often exceeded ability, but he let them have their moment. Today's scores would humble most of them soon enough. That's when an unexpected figure appeared at the far end of the range. An elderly man, probably in his late 70s, moved slowly but deliberately toward an empty firing position. He wore simple civilian clothes, faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a baseball cap with no insignia. What caught everyone's attention wasn't his age, but what he was carrying. In his weathered hands was a rifle that looked like it belonged in a history book. "Holy crap, look at Grandpa over there," whispered Private Jake Morrison, a 19-year-old from Texas who'd never seen combat but talked like he'd won 3 wars. "Is that thing even legal?" The old man seemed oblivious to the stares and whispers. He methodically set up at his position, laying out a small leather case that contained ammunition, unlike anything the young Marines had ever seen. The bullets looked hand-loaded, and the brass casings had the dull patina of age. Staff Sergeant Chen approached the elderly shooter with professional courtesy, though he couldn't hide his curiosity about the vintage weapon. "Excuse me, sir. I need to check your range card and see some identification. Also, what kind of rifle is that?" The old man looked up with clear, steady eyes. "M1 Garand, 30-06 Springfield, and here's my military ID." He handed over a card that made Chen's eyebrows raise. The ID was current, but the issue date was from decades ago. "Retired Master Sergeant William Bill Hayes," it read. "Service dates, 1965 to 1995. "Korea?" Chen asked, noting the veteran's age. "Vietnam," Hayes replied quietly. "2 tours, 5th Special Forces Group." The young Marines within earshot began to pay attention. Special Forces had a reputation even among other elite units. But looking at the frail old man with his antique rifle, it was hard to imagine him as some kind of warrior. Private Morrison couldn't keep his mouth shut. "No offense, Sergeant Hayes, but are you sure that old gun is safe to fire? It looks like it might explode in your hands." A few other Marines chuckled. Hayes smiled patiently. "She's been reliable for 60 years. I think she's got a few more rounds in her." "Yeah, but can you even see the targets from here?" asked another Marine, pointing toward the 300-yard line where their qualification would take place. "My eyes work fine, son," Hayes responded, beginning to load his rifle with those hand-loaded rounds. The distinctive ping of the Garand's loading mechanism echoed across the range, a sound none of the young Marines recognized. Staff Sergeant Chen called for the range to go hot. 20 Marines took their positions with their modern rifles, complete with optical sights, bipods, and every technological advantage the military could provide. Hayes took his position alongside them, his Garand looking primitive by comparison. but there was something different about the way he handled the weapon. While the young Marines were still adjusting their gear and fidgeting with settings, Hayes simply assumed a textbook-prone position and became perfectly still. "Targets up!" The command echoed across the range, and human silhouette targets popped up at various distances. The young Marines immediately began firing, their M4s chattering in semi-automatic mode as they engaged targets from 100 to 500 yards. The sound was exactly what you'd expect from a modern military rifle. Sharp, efficient, technological. But cutting through that modern symphony came a different sound entirely. Bang! The deep, authoritative boom of the M1 Garand was unmistakable. Then another. Bang! Each shot deliberate, measured, separated by several seconds of complete stillness. While the Marines were firing rapidly, trying to hit as many targets as possible in the allotted time, Hayes was taking his time. Each shot followed the same ritual. Breathe, aim, squeeze, follow through. The young Marines began to notice that despite their rapid fire, they weren't hearing the satisfying clang of metal hitting targets nearly as often as they'd expected. Meanwhile, every time that old Garand barked, a metallic clang echoed back from the target line. Private Morrison paused in his firing to glance over at the old man. What he saw made him forget about his own targets entirely. Hayes wasn't just hitting the targets, he was destroying them. The silhouette at 300 yards had a tight cluster of holes in the center mass. The 400-yard target showed the same precise grouping. Most impossibly, the 500-yard target, barely visible to the naked eye, was showing signs of multiple hits in the vital zones. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Staff Sergeant Chen called out as the qualification time expired. The Marines lowered their weapons and began discussing their performance, most of them confident they'd done well. But Chen was staring downrange at the target results with confusion. He picked up his binoculars and began scanning the distant targets systematically. What he saw made him call for the range safety officer immediately. "We need to score those targets," Chen said, pointing toward Hayes's lane. "All of them." The safety officer, a grizzled gunnery sergeant with 20 years of experience, took his own look through high-powered optics. His reaction was immediate and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Holy Mother of God!" The young Marines gathered around as the range personnel began retrieving targets for scoring. When Hayes's targets came back, a hush fell over the group that had been joking and laughing just minutes before. Every single target, from 100 yards out to the maximum 500-yard line, showed the same thing. Perfect center mass hits, grouped so tightly you could cover them with a silver dollar. But it wasn't just the accuracy that stunned everyone. It was the precision. While the Marines with their advanced optics and modern ammunition had scattered shots across their targets, Hayes had put every single round exactly where it would do the most damage to an enemy. The 500-yard target told the most incredible story. At that distance, most of the young Marines had struggled to hit the target at all, even with their scoped rifles. Hayes had put 8 rounds through the center of the target in a group so tight it looked like someone had used a machine rest. "That's impossible," whispered one of the Marines. "Nobody shoots that well without optics." But there was the evidence. Holes punched through paper with mechanical precision. Gunnery Sergeant Williams, the range safety officer, had seen thousands of Marines shoot over his career. He'd witnessed expert marksmen, competitive shooters, and even some legendary snipers. But he'd never seen anything like what Hayes had just demonstrated with a rifle that belonged in a museum. "Sergeant Hayes?" Williams called out. Can you explain how you just outshot 20 Marines with modern equipment using a rifle from World War II? Hayes was cleaning his Garand with the same methodical care he'd shown throughout the shoot. Practice, he said simply. Lots and lots of practice. But Private Morrison wasn't satisfied with that answer. His confidence had been shattered by what he'd witnessed, and he needed to understand how he'd been so thoroughly outclassed. Come on, there's got to be more to it than just practice. What's your secret? Hayes looked up from his rifle maintenance. For the first time since arriving at the range, he really studied the faces of the young Marines gathered around him. They weren't mocking anymore. They were hungry to learn. You want to know the real difference between your shooting and mine? Hayes asked. The Marines nodded eagerly. You were all trying to hit targets. I was trying to stop threats. The distinction seemed subtle, but Hayes continued. Every time you pulled that trigger, you were thinking about scores, about qualification standards, about impressing your buddies. Every time I pulled mine, I was remembering faces. The range went completely quiet. Faces? Asked Staff Sergeant Chen. Hayes stood slowly, his rifle now clean and cased. In 1968, outside of Da Nang, my squad was pinned down by a sniper. We couldn't see him, couldn't locate his position. But every few minutes, one of my boys would try to move and... He paused, the memory clearly still painful after all these years. I finally spotted muzzle flash from about 400 yards out. One shot. That's all I had before he'd relocate and kill more of my men. The Marines were hanging on every word. Did you get him? Morrison asked quietly. One shot, 400 yards, iron sights, enemy sniper eliminated, Hayes confirmed. But that wasn't the end of it. Over 13 months in country, I took 47 lives at ranges from 100 to 600 yards. Every single shot was to save American lives. Every single shot mattered more than anything I've done before or since. The weight of his words settled over the young Marines like a heavy blanket. They were beginning to understand that they weren't just looking at an old man with an antique rifle. They were in the presence of a genuine war hero. The reason I can outshoot all of you, Hayes continued, isn't because I'm more talented or because I have some secret technique. It's because when I learned to shoot, missing meant my brothers died. You've been training to pass a test. I was training to come home alive. Staff Sergeant Chen found his voice first. Sergeant Hayes, with all due respect, why didn't you tell us who you were when you first arrived? Hayes shouldered his rifle case and adjusted his cap. Because it shouldn't matter who I was. What should matter is what you can learn. And today, if you were paying attention, you learned that all your fancy equipment can't replace fundamentals, patience, and respect for what this rifle can do in the right hands. He began walking toward the parking area, but Morrison called out after him. Sergeant Hayes, could you maybe teach us? Show us how to shoot like that? Hayes stopped and turned back. For the first time that day, he smiled broadly. Son, I've been waiting 60 years for someone to ask me that question. 3 weeks later, Master Sergeant Hayes began showing up at Camp Pendleton every Saturday morning. Word had spread quickly through the base about the old man who'd outshot an entire platoon of Marines with a World War II rifle. What started with Morrison and a few curious Marines quickly grew into something much larger. Hayes didn't just teach shooting technique, though his marksmanship instruction was revolutionary. He taught patience, respect for the weapon, and most importantly, the mindset of a warrior who understood that every shot could mean the difference between life and death. The young Marines learned to slow down, to breathe properly, to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. But more than that, they learned to approach their weapons with the reverence Hayes showed for his old Garand. "This rifle saved my life and the lives of my brothers more times than I can count," he would tell each new group of students. "Your rifle will do the same for you if you treat it as a tool of survival, not a toy for competition." 6 months after that first day at the range, Alpha Company posted the highest marksmanship qualification scores in the battalion's history. Private Morrison, Hayes's first and most dedicated student, earned expert marksman badges and was selected for sniper training. But more importantly, every Marine who trained with Hayes carried forward a deeper understanding of their profession and their weapons. Hayes still comes to the range every Saturday. He still brings that same M1 Garand, still handloads his ammunition, and still outshots Marines 1/3 his age. But now, instead of mockery, he's greeted with the respect due a master craftsman passing on his knowledge to the next generation. The young Marines have learned that sometimes the oldest tools, in the hands of someone who truly knows how to use them, can outperform any modern technology. And sometimes, the greatest teachers are the ones who look the least like what you'd expect a hero to be. Master Sergeant William Hayes never sought recognition for his service or his skills. He simply showed up, demonstrated what a lifetime of dedication could accomplish, and reminded everyone that true expertise isn't about having the best equipment. It's about having the knowledge, patience, and respect to use any equipment to its fullest potential. The shooting range at Camp Pendleton has a small plaque now, mounted on a post near where Hayes set up that first day. It reads, "Dedicated to Master Sergeant William Hayes, who taught us that the weapon doesn't make the warrior makes the weapon." Hayes never asked for the plaque, and he never mentions it when he arrives each Saturday morning. He just sets up his gear, loads his ancient rifle, and continues to show young Marines what mastery looks like. Because that's what teachers do. They pass on their knowledge to those who need it most, whether those students know they need it or not.